We just got those oil inventories numbers out for reaction on the oil markets. We're joined by Dennis Gartman. He's economist and editor of the widely read Gartman Letter. Good morning to you, Dennis. We're seeing crude oil really pair the declines that it had been posting once we got those numbers. What's your reaction?
Well, the number is actually rather boring, Margaret. Up, 1.76 thousand barrels. I mean, 176,000 barrels, relatively inconsequential. We're still trying to figure out what happened to last week's number. I heard you earlier saying that we were down 8 million barrels last week, which was a shock. No revision, or at least I haven't seen any revision in that. So the fact that we were up 200,000 barrels is relatively unimportant. What you have to say over the past several weeks is that crude oil inventories are being worn down, not increased, and that's a change. So we sold crude oil off rather sharply yesterday. We had it down rather sharply this morning. It's bounced back. It's still lower on the day, but it's come back almost $1 from the lows after that number came out. Why are the market's expectations and the DOE's numbers so out of whack? Good question, one that I wish I were able to answer. If you take a look at what the API has, those numbers are extraordinarily erratic. The DOE numbers are getting more and more erratic. They're almost as erratic now as are the monthly employment numbers that come out. The revisions from week to week are extraordinary. You really have to look at these numbers and put some kind of smoothing, moving average upon them and say what really is happening. You need to take a look at what's really going on in Cushing. You need to take a look at what's going on in down in the Gulf. But on balance, the fact that we changed 200,000 barrels this week is, I think, a breather. It takes some of the shock out of last week's 8 million barrel decline. Well, you mentioned the weather there. The National Hurricane Center saying that Tropical Storm Danny forming in the Atlantic has about 45-mile-per-hour top winds. We're in hurricane season. How much of a factor is it going to be to the markets right now? Not much, not much. Unless that hurricane starts to take a decidedly southern move and gets into the Gulf, nobody's going to pay much attention to it at this point. And it doesn't look, from the last I saw, that one's going to do any real damage. It's early yet. It is only, the end of August. The real hurricane season doesn't begin till September 1st. But I got to tell you, living here on the seacoast or near the seacoast in Virginia, nobody's paying much attention to it this year. It's as if it's not even existing. One firm paying attention to the energy markets right now, Morgan Stanley, they just went overweight on energy in regard to the emerging markets. That note coming out overnight. Your note overnight pointing out, Dennis, that crude oil and the equity markets, it used to be that high crude oil prices were bad for the market. Now it seems that they're a lead indicator of economic rebound rather than a symptom of it. It's really quite bizarre, Margaret, isn't it? I mean, in the past, if somebody had told you a year ago that crude oil was going to be up $2 today, where the stock market going to go, you would say, well, it's got to be lower. If somebody were to tell you 3 years ago that crude oil is going to be down $2 today and said, where do you think stocks are going to go, you'd say higher. But now you have to say, no, if crude goes up, so do stocks. It makes no sense. Perhaps it's just a machination of being in the summer and illiquidity. But it is bizarre, and it's very disconcerting to those of us who grow up trying to understand reasonable correlations. Right now, the correlations that held in the past have gone completely 180 degrees in the other direction, and it's relatively confusing. China, overnight, the reports in the Chinese press that the government is considering a curb on raw material supplies. Looking outside the world of energy, you trade edible commodities, the world of commodities outside of energy. How much of that curb is going to impact you? Well, it's going to be very disconcerting if the Chinese come in and say we're going to put a curb on trade, curb on imports even or exports. I wish I understood better what Beijing is up to. You have to remember, I think Beijing, I think Shanghai are very good traders. They sometimes put out reports in order to make certain that they get a market to move in their favor. If they want to own wheat, they're not going to put out a bullish report on wheat. If they have a lot of soybeans for sale, which they don't, but if they did, they clearly are not going to put out a bearish report. So you have to take what Beijing says about a commodity with a relatively large grain of salt. Better to look at what movements are, better to look at ship changes, better to look at the actual data from that the Chicago Board of Trade puts together as to who did or who was not in a bid today or was bidding today or will be bidding tomorrow for grains. And actually what the Chinese have been is very aggressive buyers of grain recently.
All right. Quickly, Dennis, before we head out, how is the hedge fund business treating you? You just entered the market yourself about last week.
Well, actually, it's been something I've wanted to do for a long period of time, and the first week we were profitable. I guess I'm not supposed to say that on TV, but we've been very fortunate, and you know we'll see. Give me 2 years and ask me how it's doing then, Margaret.
All right, we'll do just that. Thanks so much, Dennis Gartman of the Gartman Letter.